Every single day, you pour something down your drain that a Japanese farmer 200 years ago would have called his most valuable crop input. You don't think about it. It happens in under 10 seconds. You rinse the rice, you tip the bowl, and that cloudy white water disappears. Gone. Just like that. But here's what that farmer knew, and what most home gardeners today have completely forgotten. That water's alive. Not in a poetic sense. Literally alive, carrying billions of microorganisms, natural growth compounds, and dissolved minerals that your soil is quietly starving for right now. I've been growing food in my backyard for over 20 years. I've spent money on fertilizers, on soil amendments, on bottles with impressive labels and complicated ingredient lists. Some of them worked. Most of them worked just well enough to keep me buying the next one. And for a long time, I didn't question that system. I thought that's just what gardening cost. Then I came across something that changed the way I think about soil entirely. A single jar, $1 of rice, or in most cases, nothing at all. Just the water you were already going to throw away, 7 days on a shelf. And the result is a living liquid inoculant that independent research shows can increase root mass by 40 to 60%, improve soil structure within a single month, and reduce your watering needs by nearly a third. The same category of beneficial bacteria found in this jar, lactobacillus, is the active ingredient in commercial biofertilizer products sold at garden centers for $35 to $60 a bottle. Same organism, same mechanism, 50 times the price. I'm not saying that to make you angry. I'm saying it because once you understand how this works, really understand it from the biology up, you'll never look at your kitchen sink the same way again. This isn't a shortcut, it isn't a trick. What I'm going to show you is a system that farmers across East Asia used continuously for 2,000 years before it was quietly set aside during the agricultural revolution of the 1950s. A system so simple that it requires nothing more than a glass jar, some water, and a week of patience. A system that works not because of clever chemistry, but because it works with the biology that was already in your soil. Biology that most modern gardening practices have been slowly killing off without anyone telling you. There's a reason you've never heard of this in any mainstream gardening program. There's a reason it doesn't appear on the shelf at your local garden center next to the $50 soil boosters. That reason isn't complicated, and it isn't a conspiracy. It's much simpler than that. And by the end of this video, you'll understand it completely. For now, just know this. The most powerful thing you can add to your garden this season is already in your kitchen. It costs almost nothing to make, and it has been proven across centuries and across continents to build the kind of soil that grows strong, healthy food year after year without depending on anything you have to buy. We're going to start at the beginning, not with the method, but with the story, because understanding where this came from and why it disappeared is the only way to fully trust what it can do for your garden today. Stay with me. Let me ask you something honest. If your garden hasn't been performing the way you hoped, if your plants look tired by midsummer, if your tomatoes crack before they ripen, if you keep adding fertilizer and the results keep disappointing you, I want you to consider something. It's probably not your fault, not your effort, not your dedication, not even your soil, not really. What most home gardeners were never told is that the model we've been handed is broken at the foundation, and when you build on a broken foundation, it doesn't matter how much you add on top. The results will always fall short. Here's what that broken model looks like in practice. You go to the garden center, you pick up a bag of granular fertilizer, something with a number on the front, 10-10-10 or 12-6-6, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. You apply it, the plants green up. Things look better for a few weeks. Then the effect fades. You apply again. The soil starts to feel harder, denser, less alive. You water more because it drains faster. You add more fertilizer because the plants seem to need more. And slowly, without ever meaning to, you've built a garden that cannot function without constant inputs from a bag or a bottle. That's not independence. That's a subscription you never signed up for. The problem isn't fertilizer itself. Nutrients matter. That part is real. The problem is what those synthetic inputs do to the invisible system underneath your feet. Healthy soil isn't just mineral particles and organic matter. It's an ecosystem. a dense, complex living network of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and microarthropods that have co-evolved with plant roots over hundreds of millions of years. When that system is working, it does things no fertilizer bottle can replicate. It breaks down organic material into plant-available nutrients on a slow, steady schedule. It builds soil structure so water penetrates instead of running off. It produces natural hormones that signal roots to grow deeper and wider. It suppresses harmful pathogens without any chemical intervention. Synthetic nitrogen salts, applied repeatedly at high concentrations, disrupt that system. They don't destroy it all at once. It's gradual. The pH shifts. Certain bacterial populations collapse. Fungal networks weaken. The soil becomes increasingly dependent on external inputs to do what it used to do on its own. And most gardeners never make the connection because the timeline is slow, and because the fertilizer always provides a short-term response that looks like progress. You were taught to feed your plants. What nobody told you is that your real job is to feed your soil and let the soil feed your plants. That distinction sounds small. It isn't. It is the entire difference between a garden that needs you to keep buying things and a garden that builds its own capacity over time. The method I'm going to show you doesn't feed your plants directly. It feeds the microbial life in your soil, rebuilds it, restores it, and reactivates biology that synthetic programs have been suppressing for years. Once that biology is functioning again, your plants respond in ways that no bottle of liquid fertilizer can match, because the system is doing what it was designed to do. I want to be clear about one thing before we go further. I'm not telling you to throw away everything you've been doing and start over. I'm not telling you the garden center is your enemy. What I'm saying is that there is a layer of your garden's health that you were never introduced to. And once you see it, once you understand what's actually happening in those top 6 inches of soil, everything else starts to make more sense. The farmers who understood this didn't learn it from a university extension program or a YouTube channel. They learned it from watching soil behave differently when it was cared for in a specific way. They learned it from generation to generation, quietly and practically, over a very long time. And then, in the span of about 2 decades, most of that knowledge was set aside. Not disproven, not replaced by something better, just set aside, because something cheaper to manufacture and easier to sell came along at exactly the right moment in history. That's the story we need to talk about next. To understand why this method disappeared, you have to go back further than most gardening videos are willing to go. Not 10 years, not 50, 2,000 years. In the rice farming regions of East Asia, rural Japan, the Korean Peninsula, parts of southern China, small-scale farmers developed something that modern soil scientists would now recognize as a remarkably sophisticated understanding of microbial agriculture. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't have laboratory analysis. What they had was time, observation, and an intimate relationship with the land that passed from parent to child across dozens of generations. One of the things they observed, consistently and reliably, was this: fields that received fermented organic liquids, including fermented rice water, fermented plant extracts, and fermented fish byproducts, produced stronger crops with deeper root systems in soil that stayed loose and workable year after year. Fields that didn't receive these inputs slowly became harder, less productive, more dependent on manure additions just to maintain baseline yields. The farmers couldn't explain the mechanism, but they didn't need to. The results were consistent enough to become practice. And practice became tradition, and tradition became the foundation of how those communities fed themselves for century after century. This wasn't a fringe technique. In Joseon-era Korea, a period stretching from the late 14th century through the early 20th, detailed agricultural manuals documented fermented liquid applications as a standard part of the farming calendar. In Edo period Japan, similar practices appear in regional farming records with a specificity that suggests they were deeply embedded in local agricultural culture, not occasional experiments. These weren't poor substitutes for something better. They were the system. They worked, and everyone knew they worked, and so they continued. Now, I want to tell you about a man named Cho Han-kyu. Cho is a Korean agricultural scientist, born in the mid-20th century, who grew up watching traditional farming practices being systematically replaced by the new chemical agriculture that arrived in South Korea following the Korean War. As a young man, he noticed something that troubled him. The villages that adopted synthetic fertilizers and pesticides quickly showed dramatic short-term yield increases. But within a generation, many of those same fields were showing signs of soil fatigue, compaction, declining organic matter, increasing pest pressure, growing dependency on ever larger chemical inputs. He went back to study what had been abandoned. He documented villages, including communities where his own family had roots, where the old fermented input systems had never been fully replaced. In one account that stayed with me when I first read it, he described a farming community that had not purchased a single external soil amendment in over 400 years. 4 centuries of continuous food production on the same land, using nothing that couldn't be made from what the farm itself produced. The soil in those fields, he noted, was dark, loose, and biologically dense in a way that the chemically managed fields nearby simply were not. Cho went on to develop what he called the J-Dam method, an approach to natural farming built on the same microbial principles those traditional farmers had practiced intuitively. He published his findings, trained farmers, and spent decades trying to reintroduce what had been set aside. His work remains one of the most detailed modern documentations of why fermented microbial inputs work, not as folklore, but as applied soil biology. So what happened? Why did something with a 2,000-year track record get replaced so thoroughly and so quickly? The answer is 1945. When the Second World War ended, the industrial infrastructure that had been built to manufacture explosives, specifically the Haber-Bosch process used to synthesize ammonia for munitions, needed a new purpose. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer was the answer. The same factories, the same chemical process, redirected toward agriculture. It was abundant, it was cheap to produce at scale, and it produced immediate, visible results that were easy to measure and easy to sell. What followed was the Green Revolution of the 1950s and 1960s, a genuine and well-intentioned effort to address global food insecurity through high-yield crop varieties, irrigation infrastructure, and chemical inputs. It saved lives. In terms of pure caloric output, it worked, but it also embedded a particular model of farming so deeply into global agricultural policy, education, and commerce that everything outside that model was gradually pushed to the margins. Traditional fermented input systems didn't fit the new model. You couldn't patent them. You couldn't manufacture them at industrial scale and ship them in containers. You couldn't build a distribution network around something every farm could make for free in a glass jar. So they weren't promoted, they weren't taught in agricultural colleges, they weren't featured in extension programs. They were simply left behind, not disproven, not discredited, just rendered commercially invisible. And here's the quiet irony in all of this. The biology those farmers were working with, the specific microorganisms in fermented rice water, the mechanisms by which they interact with soil and roots, was eventually studied, documented, and validated by modern science. The research exists. The data is there. It's just not on the shelf at your garden center, because there's no margin in selling something you can make at home for nothing. That's the history. Now it's time to understand why it actually works, because the science behind this is genuinely surprising, and it will change how you think about your soil from this point forward. Let's talk about what's actually happening inside that jar. When you rinse rice, the water that runs off isn't just starchy and cloudy. It's carrying a specific mixture of water-soluble compounds that have been sitting on and just beneath the surface of each grain. Fragments of B vitamins, amino acids, minerals like phosphorus and potassium, and most importantly, simple carbohydrates that act as a ready food source for microbial life. In isolation, that water has modest value. But when you give it time, warmth, and the right conditions, something changes fundamentally. The microorganisms naturally present in that water, and in the air around it, begin to multiply. And the dominant organism that emerges, given slightly acidic conditions and the carbohydrate-rich environment of rice water, is lactobacillus. You already know lactobacillus, even if you don't recognize the name. It's the organism responsible for yogurt, for kimchi, for sourdough bread. It's one of the most studied bacterial genera in existence. Well understood, well documented, and considered completely safe. In the context of food, we value it for fermentation and preservation. In the context of soil, its role is entirely different and considerably more powerful. Here's what lactobacillus actually does when it enters your soil ecosystem. The first thing it produces is lactic acid. This matters more than it sounds. Lactic acid is a mild organic acid that shifts the immediate soil environment in a way that benefits plant roots directly. It chelates, essentially unlocks, mineral compounds that are already present in your soil but bound in forms that plant roots cannot absorb. Calcium, iron, manganese, and zinc often exist in garden soil at adequate concentrations, but remain chemically unavailable to plants. Lactic acid changes that. It doesn't add new minerals. It makes the ones already there accessible. This is a distinction that most synthetic fertilizer programs miss entirely because they're designed to add inputs, not to activate what's already present. The second thing a thriving lactobacillus population does is suppress pathogenic organisms. Lactic acid creates a local soil environment that is inhospitable to many of the harmful bacteria and fungi responsible for root rot, damping off, and soil-borne disease. It doesn't sterilize, and this is important, because sterilization is the opposite of what healthy soil needs. It selectively favors beneficial microbial populations while creating conditions that harmful organisms struggle to survive in. This is the same principle behind fermented foods lasting longer without refrigeration. Applied to soil, it means a garden that is quietly more disease-resistant without any chemical fungicide involved. The third effect is the one that produces the most visible results, and it's the one that brings us to the $40 bottle comparison. Among the compounds produced during lactobacillus fermentation are several classes of biologically active molecules: organic acids, enzymes, and most significantly, compounds that behave like plant growth hormones. The one that matters most here is indole-3 acetic acid, known as IAA. IAA is the primary naturally occurring oxidant in plants, the hormone class responsible for directing cell elongation, root initiation, and root branching. When IAA is present at the root zone in sufficient concentration, roots don't just grow, they proliferate. They branch aggressively, reaching further into the soil profile, accessing water and nutrients from a dramatically larger volume of soil. This is precisely why the research on fermented rice water applications consistently shows root mass increases in the range of 40 to 60%. It's not that the plant is receiving more nitrogen or more phosphorus, it's that the root architecture itself is fundamentally improved, and a better root system changes every other aspect of plant performance downstream. Water uptake improves, nutrient absorption increases, stress tolerance, both drought, stress, and heat stress, rises significantly. The plant becomes structurally more capable from the ground up. Now here is where the $40 bottle enters the picture. Walk into any serious garden center and you'll find a section dedicated to biological soil amendments. Products marketed as microbial inoculants, beneficial bacteria blends, rhizosphere activators. The active ingredients listed on the labels of the most popular products in this category are consistently lactobacillus species, bacillus species, and various auxin-producing soil bacteria. The marketing is sophisticated, the packaging is professional, and the price point, typically $35 to $60 for a small bottle, reflects the assumption that what's inside is rare, complex, or difficult to produce. It isn't, not remotely. The fermentation process you're going to use produces the same core organisms in comparable concentrations from materials that cost nothing or close to nothing. The difference isn't biological, it's commercial. One version comes in a bottle with a label and a barcode. The other comes from a jar on your kitchen shelf after 7 days of patient waiting. The mechanism by which both of them improve root growth, support soil biology, and increase plant resilience is identical, because the biology doesn't change based on the packaging. I want to add one more layer here, because this is the part that I find genuinely remarkable. The soil food web, the full network of organisms that makes healthy soil function, doesn't operate as a collection of independent actors. It operates as a system, where different organisms depend on and support each other in ways that are deeply interconnected. When you introduce a thriving lactobacillus population into soil, you're not just adding one beneficial organism, you're providing a food source and a favorable environment for a broader cascade of microbial activity. Protozoa that feed on bacteria become more active. Fungal populations that thrive in slightly acidic, biologically rich conditions begin to expand. The mycorrhizal networks that connect plant roots to each other and to the wider soil ecosystem become more extensive and more functional. In other words, a jar of fermented rice water isn't just delivering one input, it's reactivating a system, the same system that those East Asian farmers were maintaining intuitively for 2,000 years, without ever knowing the names of the organisms involved. They knew what the results looked like. Now you know why. And knowing why makes the next part, the method itself, not just a set of steps to follow, but a process you actually understand from the inside out. This is the part where most gardening videos lose me. They give you a list, 7 bullet points, 3 diagrams, a table of ratios, and by the time you finished reading, you feel like you need a laboratory and a degree in microbiology just to get started. That's not what this is. What I'm going to describe is something a farmer's grandmother was doing in rural Korea 400 years ago with nothing more than a clay pot and a piece of cloth. The simplicity is the point. If it required expensive equipment or specialized knowledge, it wouldn't have survived 2,000 years of practical use. There are 3 stages to this method: preparation, fermentation, and application. Each one is straightforward. Each one has a clear logic behind it that you now understand well enough to troubleshoot on your own if something looks off. Let's go through them one at a time. The first stage is preparation, and it begins before you even turn on the stove. When you rinse rice before cooking, and if you're rinsing 2 or 3 cups of dry rice, which is enough for a typical family meal, you produce approximately 1 to 2 cups of rice wash water after the first rinse. This first rinse is what you want. It carries the highest concentration of water-soluble starches, B vitamins, and mineral compounds from the grain surface. The second and third rinses are progressively cleaner and progressively less useful for our purposes. So the practice is simple. Place a bowl beneath your colander, rinse your rice once, and keep that water. That's your base material. Cost $0 because you were rinsing the rice anyway. If you don't cook rice regularly, or if you want to produce a larger quantity, you can achieve the same result by combining 1 part dry white rice with 5 parts clean water, stirring vigorously for 30 to 60 seconds, and straining off the liquid. Brown rice works as well. The key variable is the starch and surface compound content of the water, not the variety of rice. In this case, your cost is the rice itself. Roughly $1 per 2 pounds at most grocery stores, which produces far more rice wash water than you'll need for a single batch. Pour your rice wash water into a clean glass jar. A standard wide-mouth mason jar works perfectly. 16 ounces or 32 ounces, depending on how much liquid you've collected. Glass is preferable to plastic because it doesn't off-gas compounds that can interfere with the fermentation process at the microbial level. If glass isn't available, a clean plastic container works, but rinse it thoroughly first. Leave 2 to 3 inches of headspace at the top of the jar. The fermentation process produces carbon dioxide gas, and you need room for pressure to equalize without forcing the lid. Cover the opening loosely. A piece of breathable cloth secured with a rubber band is ideal. Cheesecloth, a clean cotton dish towel, even a doubled layer of paper towel. The goal is to allow gas exchange while keeping dust and insects out. Do not seal the jar airtight during fermentation. A sealed jar will build pressure and can crack or overflow. Loose coverage is intentional, not careless. The second stage is fermentation, and this is where patience becomes the active ingredient. Place your covered jar somewhere at room temperature. Between 65 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit is the ideal range. A kitchen counter away from direct sunlight works well. A shelf in a garage or shed works in warmer months. What you're looking for is stable, moderate warmth. Avoid placing the jar in direct sunlight, which can overheat the liquid and kill the microbial cultures before they establish. Avoid temperatures below 60 degrees. which will slow the fermentation to the point where the wrong organisms, yeasts and molds rather than lactobacillus, gain the upper hand. Leave the jar undisturbed for 5 to 7 days. In warmer conditions, closer to 80 degrees, 5 days is usually sufficient. In cooler conditions, 7 days or slightly longer may be needed. Once each day, remove the cover briefly and stir the liquid gently with a clean spoon. This introduces a small amount of fresh oxygen to the surface layers and prevents any surface film from becoming too dense. Around day 3 or 4, you'll begin to notice changes. The liquid will shift from a pale, milky white to a slightly more translucent appearance as the starch is consumed by microbial activity. You may see small bubbles at the surface. This is carbon dioxide being released as fermentation proceeds, and it's a sign that the process is working correctly. By day 5 to 7, the liquid will have a distinctly sour, mildly acidic smell, similar to the smell of yogurt or mild sourdough. Not unpleasant, but noticeably tangy. That smell is lactic acid, and it is exactly what you're looking for. It confirms that lactobacillus has become the dominant organism in the jar. If you see fuzzy surface mold, green, black, or white with a powdery texture, discard the batch and start over. This typically indicates the jar wasn't clean enough, the temperature was too low, or the headspace was sealed too tightly. It happens occasionally, especially in the first attempt. It doesn't mean the method doesn't work. It means the conditions weren't quite right, and adjusting one variable, usually temperature or jar cleanliness, resolves it immediately. When the liquid smells sour and clean, with no off-putting or putrid odor, your ferment is ready. Strain it through a fine mesh strainer or cloth to remove any settled solids and transfer the liquid to a clean jar for storage. At this point, you have a concentrated microbial inoculant. Stored in a cool location out of direct sunlight, it will remain active and usable for 2 to 3 weeks at room temperature or up to 3 months in a refrigerator. The third stage is application, and this is where the ratio matters. Fermented rice water in its concentrated form is too acidic and too biologically dense to apply directly to roots at full strength. What you want is a diluted solution that delivers the organisms and their byproducts to the root zone at a concentration the soil ecosystem can absorb and integrate without disruption. The standard dilution ratio for soil application is 1 part fermented rice water to 20 parts clean water. For a standard watering can holding approximately 2 gallons, that means roughly 2 tablespoons of your ferment added to the full can of water. Stir gently and apply immediately. Don't let the diluted solution sit for hours before use, as the dilution changes the microbial environment and the organisms begin to decline once separated from their concentrated medium. Apply the diluted solution directly to the soil at the base of your plants, not to the foliage. You're targeting the root zone, the top 6 inches of soil, where the majority of root activity and microbial interaction occurs. Apply until the soil is visibly moist but not waterlogged. For established plants in the ground, a thorough application once every 10 to 14 days during the active growing season produces consistent results. For seedlings or plants in containers, once every 7 to 10 days at a slightly lower concentration, 1 part to 25 parts water, reduces the risk of over-acidifying the limited soil volume. The first visible results typically appear within 2 to 3 weeks of beginning regular application. You'll notice it first in the foliage, a deepening of green color as mineral availability improves, and a subtle increase in leaf thickness and firmness. By week 4 to 6, if you have the opportunity to examine the root zone of a container plant, you'll see the difference clearly. The root mass will be noticeably more developed, with finer branching and a healthier off-white color rather than the brown or translucent appearance of stressed roots. One additional note that I think is important. This method works best as part of a consistent, ongoing practice rather than a single application. You're not adding a chemical that produces an immediate reaction and then dissipates. You're reintroducing living organisms into a biological system. And like any living system, it takes time to establish, stabilize, and build. The farmers who use this method didn't apply it once and move on. It was part of their seasonal rhythm, as reliable and regular as watering itself. That consistency is what produces the long-term results. And those long-term results are what we need to talk about next. Specifically, what a garden that runs on this system looks like after a full season compared to one that's still dependent on what comes in a bottle. Let me paint you a picture of two gardens side by side. Same neighborhood, same climate, same soil type to begin with. A fairly typical suburban backyard mix, moderate organic matter, slightly compacted from years of foot traffic and occasional tilling. Same crops planted in the same week of the same spring. One garden follows a conventional program, a granular balanced fertilizer applied at planting, a liquid feed every 2 weeks through the season, a fungicide spray when the weather turns humid. The other garden receives no synthetic inputs at all, just fermented rice water, applied on a consistent schedule, starting 6 weeks before planting to build the soil biology first, then continuing through the growing season. By midsummer, the differences are not subtle. I've watched this comparison play out in my own garden over multiple seasons, and I've read the documented results from JADAM trials and independent small farm studies that have tracked the same variables with more scientific rigor than I can claim from my own backyard. What consistently emerges is a pattern that surprises people who have only ever worked within the conventional input model, because the biologically managed garden doesn't just match the chemically managed one. In several key measures, it outperforms it. And it does so with a cost difference that becomes more striking the longer the comparison runs. Let's start with the numbers that matter most to a home gardener. In controlled trials using lactobacillus-based fermented input systems on vegetable crops, tomatoes, peppers, leafy greens, root vegetables, root dry mass increases of 40 to 60% compared to unfertilized controls are consistently documented. When compared directly to synthetic nitrogen programs, the root mass advantage of the biological approach typically falls in the 15 to 30% range, depending on crop variety and soil starting conditions. That gap sounds modest until you understand what root architecture actually controls. Every additional centimeter of root reach translates into access to a larger soil volume. More water, more minerals, more microbial partners. A plant with 40% more root mass is not 40% better at absorbing water. It's accessing soil zones that the less rooted plant cannot reach at all. During a dry week in July, that difference is the gap between a plant that wilts and recovers slowly and a plant that barely shows stress. Water retention is the second major variable, and it's the one that tends to convince skeptical gardeners faster than anything else. Healthy microbial populations, particularly the bacterial and fungal communities that a consistent fermented input program supports, produce biological glues, technically called glomalin and extracellular polysaccharides, that bind soil particles together into aggregates. These aggregates create the pore structure that makes soil feel crumbly and loose rather than dense and compacted. That pore structure does two things simultaneously that seem contradictory until you understand the physics. It allows excess water to drain freely after heavy rain, preventing waterlogging and root oxygen deprivation, while also creating micro-reservoirs that retain moisture during dry periods far more effectively than compacted soil. Gardeners who transition to biological input programs consistently report a reduction in watering frequency of 20 to 35% within a single season. Not because they're applying less water per session, but because the soil holds and delivers it more efficiently between sessions. Now let's talk about what this costs, honestly and specifically, over a full growing season. A conventional home garden program, granular starter fertilizer, liquid feed concentrate, 1 or 2 fungicide applications, perhaps a bag of mycorrhizal inoculant from the garden center that you added after reading about soil biology, runs somewhere between $60 and $120 for a modest backyard plot over a single season. That's a conservative estimate. Many gardeners spend considerably more, especially once they start chasing specific deficiencies with targeted products. The inputs are consumable. Every season, you start again at zero. The soil doesn't retain the investment. In fact, as we discussed earlier, repeated synthetic inputs gradually reduce the soil's own biological capacity, meaning the dependency tends to increase rather than decrease over time. The fermented rice water program, run consistently for a full season, costs the rice water itself. which is zero if you're a household that cooks rice regularly, plus the occasional mason jar and a rubber band. Call it $2 for the season, generously. If you choose to supplement with a simple compost application in early spring, which pairs exceptionally well with the microbial program because it provides organic matter for the bacteria to colonize, add another $10 to $15 for a bag of quality compost. Total seasonal investment, under $20, for a garden that is actively building biological capacity with every application rather than depleting it. But here's the comparison that I think deserves the most attention, because it's the one the short-term numbers miss entirely. In year one of a biological input program, the results are good. Noticeably better root development, improved water retention, healthier foliage. In year two, on the same plot with the same inputs, the results are measurably better than year one, because the microbial populations established in the first season have had time to expand, diversify, and integrate more deeply into the soil food web. By year three, gardeners who have maintained consistent biological programs report soil conditions that are fundamentally transformed. Darker in color, richer in organic matter, loose and structured in a way that becomes self-sustaining rather than input-dependent. This is the trajectory that the conventional input model cannot replicate, because it works in the opposite direction. Synthetic programs produce a ceiling, a level of performance that requires constant inputs to maintain, and that declines the moment those inputs stop. The biological program produces a floor that rises over time. The longer you maintain it, the less work it requires and the better it performs. I want to be specific about one more comparison because I think it's the most direct. The commercial biofertilizer product that most closely parallels what fermented rice water produces? A well-known lactobacillus-based soil inoculant sold in a 16-ounce bottle at major garden retailers. Retails for between $38 and $55, depending on the store. The label recommends application every 2 weeks during the growing season. For a standard 6-month growing season, that's 12 applications. At the recommended dilution rate for a small garden, one bottle covers approximately 4 to 6 applications. So a full season of that product costs between $76 and $165, depending on garden size and application frequency. The active ingredient is lactobacillus. The mechanism is lactic acid production, mineral chelation, and auxin stimulation of root growth. The biology is identical to what a jar of fermented rice water produces. The price difference across a single season is between $74 and $163. Across 10 years of gardening, you're looking at a difference of $740 to $730 for the same biological outcome, from the same organism, applied the same way. I'm not telling you the commercial product doesn't work. It does. I'm telling you that the jar on your kitchen shelf, given 7 days, produces the same result. And that the gap between those two options exists not because one is better than the other biologically, but because one can be sold and one cannot. Your garden doesn't know the difference. Your soil doesn't care about the label. The bacteria colonizing your root zone tonight have no awareness of whether they arrived in a branded bottle or a repurposed mason jar. They do the same work either way. And that work, quiet, consistent, invisible, and extraordinarily effective, is what we've been building toward this entire conversation. Which brings us to the only question that actually matters now. What do you do with this? I want to end this the way I started it. Honestly, not with a list of products to buy, not with a dramatic call to action, not with a countdown timer or a limited time offer, just with the same quiet observation that a farmer in rural Korea might have offered a neighbor who asked why his crops looked different from everyone else's on the same street, in the same season, under the same sky. He would have said, I started earlier. I paid attention to what was already there, and I didn't stop. That's the whole method, distilled to its essence. What I've described in this video isn't a revolution, it's a return to a way of thinking about soil that prioritized building over buying, that understood patience as a form of investment, and that recognized the most powerful inputs available to a gardener were often the ones already present, in the kitchen, in the compost pile, in the living biology of the soil itself. That way of thinking didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it couldn't be packaged and sold. And now, because the science has finally caught up with what those farmers already knew, we have the vocabulary to understand exactly why it worked and exactly how to bring it back. Here's what I want you to actually do with this. Not everything at once. Not a complete overhaul of how you garden starting this weekend. That's not how biological systems work, and it's not how lasting habits form either. What I'd suggest is this. Start with one bed, or one container, or even just one plant that you're willing to observe carefully over the next 6 to 8 weeks. Make your first jar of fermented rice water this week. It takes 10 minutes and costs nothing if you're cooking rice tonight anyway. Apply it on the schedule we discussed. And then watch. Watch the soil. Watch the root zone if you have a container plant you can tip out and examine. Watch the foliage color, the stem thickness, the way the plant responds to a dry week compared to how it responded before. You don't need instruments. You don't need a control group. You just need to pay attention with the same patient curiosity that farmers have brought to their land for as long as farming has existed. What you'll find, I think, is that the results speak clearly enough that you won't need anyone to convince you to continue. And if the first batch doesn't work, if you get surface mold, if the smell isn't right, if the fermentation stalls, adjust one variable and try again. This is a biological process, not a chemical one, which means it responds to conditions rather than formulas. Temperature matters, cleanliness matters, patience matters. But the process itself is forgiving in a way that chemistry isn't, because living systems have been adapting to imperfect conditions for hundreds of millions of years. You're working with a resilient biology. Give it reasonable conditions, and it will meet you more than halfway. I also want to say something about what this represents beyond the garden, because I think it matters. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing how to produce something of real value from almost nothing. It's not the confidence of having bought the right product or followed the right program. It's the confidence of understanding, of knowing why something works well enough to do it yourself, adjust it when needed, and teach it to someone else. That kind of knowledge doesn't expire. It doesn't depend on a supply chain or a store being open or a product being available. It lives in you, and it compounds over time the same way a healthy soil ecosystem does. Every jar of fermented rice water you make is a small act of that independence. It's a decision to use what's already in your kitchen rather than buying what someone else has packaged from it. It's a choice to build your soil's capacity rather than lease it from a fertilizer company one season at a time. These are small choices, but they accumulate. And a garden that's been managed this way for 3 or 4 seasons doesn't look like a garden that's one missed application away from decline. It looks like a garden that belongs to someone who understands what they're doing. That's what those East Asian farmers had. Not better land, not more money, not access to products we don't have today. They had knowledge. Specific, practical, generational knowledge about how to work with the biology that was already present in their soil. They passed it down because it worked, and because it gave them something that no commercial input could ever fully replace: the ability to feed their families from their own land, on their own terms, season after season, without asking permission or writing a check. We lost most of that knowledge in the space of about 2 generations. Not through anyone's malice, just through the momentum of a new system that moved faster than the old one and promised more in the short term. But the biology didn't change. The soil still works the same way it always has. Lactobacillus still does exactly what it's always done in the presence of starch, warmth, and time. The roots still respond to auxins the same way they responded 10,000 years ago. None of that was lost. It was just waiting for someone to come back to it. You now have everything you need: a jar, some rice water, 7 days, and a garden that's ready to respond. Start this week, apply it consistently, observe what changes, and at the end of the season, look at your soil. Really look at it, the color, the structure, the way it feels in your hand, and compare it to what it looked like when you started. That comparison will tell you everything.